It was a cool night in 1936, the streets of Harlem alive with the usual hustle and bustle. The air smelled of cheap whiskey and street food, but there was something else in the air tonight, something heavier. Bumpy Johnson, a name that commanded both respect and fear, was standing at the corner of 125th Street, his eyes scanning the crowd. His fingers twitched, not out of nervousness, but out of instinct. He had lived this life for so long, he could feel the tension before it hit. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows on the cracked sidewalks, and in the midst of the nightly chaos, Bumpy knew something was about to go down. His men had been telling him for weeks that there was a rat in the ranks, and tonight Bumpy was going to find out who. He wasn't a stranger to violence, but tonight felt different. This wasn't just about taking someone out. It was about something deeper, something personal. Whoever had crossed him would pay with more than just their life. They'd pay with their legacy. The message had to be clear. Betrayal had no place in Harlem, not when it was the lifeblood of everything Bumpy had worked for. The footsteps approaching from behind interrupted his thoughts. He turned slowly, his gaze locking onto the figure who stepped out of the shadows. A tall man, wearing a fedora and a trench coat, his face hidden in the dark. "You've been running your mouth," Bumpy said, his voice low but carrying enough weight to stop anyone in their tracks. The man's name was Johnny, a small-time hustler who had made a big mistake by thinking he could double-cross Bumpy. He was the rat, the man who had fed information to the wrong people, and tonight he would pay the price. You don't understand, Bumpy," Johnny stammered, his voice shaking. I was just doing what I had to do. I didn't mean for it to get this far. Bumpy's eyes narrowed. He had heard it all before. Excuses, lies, pleas for mercy. But there was no mercy when it came to betrayal. The streets didn't work that way. "You had a choice, Johnny," Bumpy said, his hands sliding into his coat, his fingers brushing against the cold steel of his revolver. "And you chose wrong." Johnny's face turned pale. The sweat beaded on his forehead as he took a step back, but Bumpy was faster. Before Johnny could even react, Bumpy pulled the gun from his coat, his aim steady. The single shot rang out, echoing through the empty street. Johnny fell to the ground, the sound of his body hitting the pavement drowned out by the rush of adrenaline coursing through Bumpy's veins. Bumpy stood there for a moment, the weight of what he had just done settling in. It wasn't the first time he'd taken a life, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about survival. It was about sending a message that anyone who crossed Bumpy Johnson would pay, no matter how small the betrayal. He holstered the gun and turned his back on Johnny's body, his mind already shifting to the next move. Harlem was his, and he was untouchable. Bumpy Johnson wasn't born into greatness. He built it, brick by brick, in the hard streets of Harlem. Born in 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, he moved to Harlem as a young man, hoping to find his fortune in a city that had always been both a haven and a battleground for those who lived there. By the time 1936 came around, Bumpy was a well-known figure in Harlem, feared by his enemies and respected by his allies. He wasn't just a gangster, he was a king in his own right, ruling over the most vibrant and dangerous neighborhood in New York City. Harlem was a melting pot of ambition, crime, and dreams, and Bumpy had learned early on how to navigate its treacherous waters. He had worked his way up from street-level hustling to becoming one of the most powerful figures in the city's criminal underworld. His influence stretched far beyond the drug trade and the gambling dens. He controlled the flow of money, information, and respect. But being the king of Harlem wasn't without its challenges. The city was a battleground where the stakes were high, and loyalty was everything. Trust was hard-earned and easily broken. Bumpy had always understood that in this world, betrayal was the one thing that could bring a man down faster than any rival. And so, he kept a tight grip on his territory, ensuring that anyone who stepped out of line paid the price. It wasn't just about controlling the streets. It was about maintaining the respect that came with power. And in 1936, Harlem had a new king. Bumpy's reputation for ruthlessness and loyalty was his greatest asset. He wasn't a man to be crossed, and those who did quickly learned the cost of their mistakes. The world outside Harlem didn't understand him, but Harlem did. The community saw Bumpy as a protector, a man who ruled not just with fear, but with a sense of order and justice. To the people in Harlem, he wasn't just a criminal. He was the one who kept the streets safe from the corrupt officials, the crooked cops, and the predators who preyed on the weak. As Bumpy's power grew, so did the number of people who wanted to take him down. Rivals from other neighborhoods, corrupt city officials, and even men from within his own ranks saw Bumpy as a threat to their own ambitions. But Bumpy had always known how to handle threats. He had survived every challenge, every betrayal, and every attempt on his life. But there was always a point of no return, a line that once crossed could never be undone. It wasn't long before Bumpy began to feel the pressure. There were whispers in the streets, rumors about who was gunning for him. His rise to power had ruffled feathers, and now there were men who believed they could take his place. A new challenger had appeared on the horizon, a man named Dutch Schultz, a ruthless gangster from the Bronx with ambitions of his own. Schultz had heard about Bumpy's influence in Harlem and wanted a piece of it for himself. Schultz wasn't a man who played by the same rules Bumpy had lived by. He was a businessman at heart, but his ruthlessness made him dangerous. He wanted to carve out his own territory in Harlem, and he didn't care who he had to kill to get it. He saw Bumpy as a rival, a man who had what he wanted. But Bumpy wasn't going to give up his throne without a fight. The tension between the two men grew, and soon, rumors of a confrontation reached Bumpy's ears. Schultz had been making moves, buying up businesses and making promises to those who had once worked for Bumpy. The betrayal was in the air, and Bumpy knew it was only a matter of time before Dutch made his move. But Bumpy wasn't afraid of Schultz, or anyone for that matter. He knew how to play the game. He knew how to outsmart his rivals, how to strike first and hit hard. And in this world, the first move was always the most important. The tension between Bumpy Johnson and Dutch Schultz was like a storm brewing on the horizon. Every move that Schultz made, every business he bought, every man he tried to recruit, only deepened the divide. Harlem, once a place where Bumpy's word was law, was now a battleground, with new players arriving, looking to carve their names into the streets. Bumpy had always dealt with rivals before, but Schultz was different. He wasn't just another gangster looking to stake a claim. Schultz was smart, calculating, and more dangerous because he didn't rely on brute force alone. He knew how to work the system, how to manipulate the politicians, the cops, and even the media. Bumpy had heard the rumors. Schultz was working with the higher-ups, and if he had the backing of the right people, he could very well take over Harlem without firing a single shot. But Bumpy wasn't a man who waited for his enemies to strike first. He knew that in this world, control wasn't just about muscle. It was about respect, loyalty, and who you could trust. Bumpy had earned the loyalty of Harlem's people by standing by them. And now he would have to remind everyone that no one, not even Dutch Schultz, could take that from him. The first move came one crisp evening when Bumpy received word that one of his men, a longtime associate named Ray, had been seen meeting with Dutch Schultz's crew. Ray wasn't just any foot soldier. He had been with Bumpy for years, trusted implicitly with some of his most sensitive dealings. If Ray was involved with Schultz, it was more than just a simple negotiation. It was a betrayal. Bumpy's jaw clenched as he learned more. Ray had been seen several times over the past week, slipping into a nightclub that was known to be a front for Schultz's operations. A few of Bumpy's men had followed him, keeping a low profile, and confirmed that Ray was not only meeting with Schultz, but discussing how they could take down Bumpy's operation. This wasn't just about a disloyal man. This was about someone trying to take everything Bumpy had worked for. Ray's betrayal was the catalyst that set everything in motion. The message was clear. Dutch Schultz was coming for Bumpy, and Ray had made the mistake of aligning himself with the enemy. The night of the confrontation came faster than Bumpy had anticipated. Word spread quickly that Ray was at the nightclub again, and Bumpy knew that if he didn't act now, he'd risk losing control of the situation. The nightclub was on 7th Avenue, a place where Bumpy's men had always been in control. But now it was a symbol of the shifting power. Schultz's men were gaining ground. Bumpy arrived with his most trusted lieutenants, Big Jim, Al, and a few others who knew how to handle business in the streets. They moved quickly, slipping into the shadows, their steps silent on the wet pavement. Bumpy's eyes were focused, his mind clear. He wasn't here for a conversation. This was about making a statement. As they entered the club, the noise of jazz music and the chatter of patrons washed over them. Bumpy's eyes scanned the room, landing on Ray sitting in a corner booth with two men Bumpy didn't recognize. He motioned for his men to hold back. This was a delicate moment. One wrong move, and things could escalate beyond his control. "Ray?" Bumpy's voice cut through the noise, a low, dangerous tone that instantly grabbed the attention of everyone in the room. Ray froze, his eyes widening as he looked up. "Bumpy," Ray said, his voice shaking. "I didn't—" "Shut up," Bumpy interrupted, his eyes cold. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "You've been playing both sides, Ray, and now you're going to pay the price." The two men sitting next to Ray stood up, but they were no match for Bumpy's men. Big Jim and Al were already at the table, stepping in between the strangers and Bumpy. The tension in the air was palpable, but Bumpy didn't flinch. He'd been in far worse situations before. This was just another lesson for anyone who thought they could betray him and walk away. Ray stood, his hands raised in a defensive posture, his face filled with regret. "Bumpy, please. It wasn't like that. I was just trying to—" "Trying to what? Play both sides? You thought you could help Schultz take me down? You should have known better." Bumpy's voice was calm, but there was a deadly edge to it. Ray opened his mouth to speak, but before he could get a word out, Bumpy was already moving. He grabbed Ray by the collar and slammed him back into the booth, his voice quiet but commanding. "You don't get to talk to me like you're some kind of friend, Ray. You crossed the line, and now you're going to pay the price." The room was dead silent now. The patrons, sensing the danger, had fallen back, their eyes darting between Bumpy and Ray. No one dared to speak. Bumpy wasn't just a gangster, he was a force of nature, and in moments like this, his authority was absolute. Ray's eyes were desperate, pleading. I didn't know it was going to go this far, Bumpy. I didn't mean for it to—" "I don't care what you meant, Ray," Bumpy said, his grip tightening around his neck. "You made a choice, and now you're going to live with it." Bumpy took a step back, his eyes scanning the room. He wasn't going to do it here, in front of everyone. No, this needed to be private. The message needed to be clear. Without a word, Bumpy turned and walked out of the club, his men following behind him. Ray, humiliated and broken, knew what was coming next. The law might not have caught him yet, but Bumpy was the real authority in Harlem, and no one got away with betrayal. Bumpy and his crew moved through the darkened streets of Harlem, the heavy sound of their boots echoing in the silence of the night. They had made their point at the nightclub, but the situation wasn't over. The betrayal that had been exposed, the conspiracy with Schultz, it was all coming to a head, and Bumpy knew he had to finish it before it finished him. He could feel the weight of the decision he had made earlier. It wasn't just about Ray, it was about sending a message to anyone else who might think they could get away with crossing him. Bumpy wasn't the kind of man who tolerated betrayal. In his world, there were consequences. No exceptions. Loyalty was everything. They reached the old warehouse on the edge of Harlem, a place Bumpy had used for years to settle disputes and deal with matters that required discretion. It was as much a part of him as the streets themselves. The night air was cool, carrying with it a sense of finality. Bumpy walked ahead, his steps deliberate, his mind focused on what was to come. Big Jim, who had been walking beside him, looked at him with a knowing expression. "You sure about this, Bumpy? he asked, his voice low but tinged with concern. "Ray's been with you for a long time. This isn't easy, even for you." Bumpy didn't hesitate. "It's not about what's easy, Jim. It's about what needs to be done. Ray had a choice. He made it. Now he'll live with it." Jim nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of Bumpy's words. There was no room for weakness in Bumpy Johnson's world. He had risen to power by making hard choices, and tonight he was about to make another one. Inside the warehouse, the dim light illuminated the cold, barren walls. Ray was already there, waiting. His hands were tied to a chair, his face pale, his body slumped in defeat. He had tried to plead, tried to beg for his life, but Bumpy knew there was no going back. The betrayal was too deep, too dangerous. There was no room for negotiation now. Bumpy stepped forward, his gaze locking with Ray's. For a moment, there was silence, just the weight of what had happened hanging in the air. Ray's eyes were filled with fear, his mouth dry, as if the truth of his situation had only just fully sunk in. "Please, Bumpy," Ray began, his voice shaking. I never wanted this. I thought I could make things right. I wasn't trying to hurt you. "Enough," Bumpy said, cutting him off with a single word. His voice was calm but full of finality. "You thought you could play both sides. You thought you could get in bed with Schultz and still walk away from this untouched. But that's not how it works in my world." Ray's head dropped in shame, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. I thought I could keep it under control," he whispered, almost to himself. Bumpy stepped closer, his face hardening. "That's the problem with men like you. You think you can control the game, but the game controls you, and now you've crossed me. That's something you can never take back." Ray's breath hitched in his throat as Bumpy reached into his coat. In a swift motion, he pulled out his revolver and aimed it directly at Ray's chest. The tension in the room was unbearable. Ray's heart raced as he looked up, his eyes wide with terror. He had made the mistake of thinking he could outwit the one man who had mastered this game. He had gambled and lost. "You had a choice, Ray," Bumpy said quietly, his eyes never leaving the man's face. "You made it, and now you'll pay." There was a flash of realization in Ray's eyes, and then, before he could even utter another word, Bumpy pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, echoing through the empty warehouse. Ray's body slumped forward, lifeless, the finality of his betrayal now sealed in blood. For a moment, Bumpy stood there, looking down at the man who had once been his ally. His mind didn't dwell on the act. He had done what needed to be done, but the weight of it still lingered in the air, thick and heavy. This wasn't just a message to Ray, it was a message to anyone else who might think they could do the same. There was no room for disloyalty in Harlem. Bumpy had made that clear. He turned and nodded at Big Jim, who stood silently at his side. "Take care of this," Bumpy said quietly, his voice steady but resolute. Big Jim nodded and moved to handle the body, making sure there were no traces left behind. Bumpy didn't watch. He didn't need to. He had already made his decision, and the streets would remember the cost of crossing him. He wasn't a man to be trifled with, and anyone who thought otherwise would soon learn the hard way. The aftermath of Ray's death rippled through Harlem, but it was the kind of ripple that only strengthened Bumpy's grip on the city. His reputation had always been built on respect, fear, and loyalty. Now, those who had once questioned his authority would think twice before ever crossing him again. Word spread fast about what had happened in the warehouse, and the message was clear. Bumpy Johnson was not to be trifled with. Anyone who thought they could outsmart him, who thought they could play both sides, would end up just like Ray, dead and forgotten. The community responded in a way that only Harlem could. Bumpy's men remained loyal, knowing that loyalty was what kept them safe. The streets that Bumpy controlled were his. No one would take them from him, not without a fight. And in Harlem, Bumpy's word was final. Those who had worked for him, who had once questioned his authority, now saw firsthand what it meant to cross the king. The consequences were swift, unforgiving, and permanent. The feds, still circling, had no way to touch Bumpy. They had tried before, but Bumpy had always stayed one step ahead. They had their informants, their wiretaps, but they didn't understand the streets the way Bumpy did. They didn't know the men who worked for him, the community that stood behind him. The betrayal they sought to expose was buried deeper than they could ever imagine. As the years passed, Bumpy Johnson's name would become synonymous with power, respect, and the unyielding grip he had on Harlem. His legend would grow, not just as a crime boss, but as the protector of his people. In a world of violence and betrayal, Bumpy had shown the streets that loyalty meant everything. His decision to take down Ray, to make an example of him, had solidified his status as Harlem's true king. No one dared to challenge him again, not the mafia, not the feds, and certainly not the criminals who once thought they could outsmart him. Bumpy had learned early on that the price of betrayal was steep, and his actions in 1936 would resonate for decades to come. Bumpy Johnson's first kill wasn't just a turning point for him, it was a defining moment in the history of Harlem. It was the moment when his power was cemented, when he proved that no one was above the law of the streets. In a world where betrayal ran rampant and the strong preyed on the weak, Bumpy showed that respect could only be earned through loyalty and force. This wasn't just about one man's pride. It was about establishing a code of honor that would rule the streets for years to come. Bumpy Johnson didn't just take lives, he built an empire on respect. And in doing so, he became a legend whose name would echo through Harlem for generations. And so the streets of Harlem learned that loyalty was everything. Betrayal, no matter how small, would always cost more than a man could ever afford.